Hi there, my name's Paris Bartholomew and I'm a motivational speaker. I've been a motivational speaker for about 6 years now, and my background is psychology, teaching, training, and lecturing. I taught health and social care for many years at some secondary schools across Essex, and I also have a background in youth work and supporting young people. I'm really passionate about resilience, and I'm really keen to talk to you guys today about resilience and relationships. Just as a start, let's talk about what we actually mean by resilience. I like the analogy of elastic band. People say that resilience is the ability to bounce back, but actually, there's probably a lot more to resilience than that. And I'd like to suggest that resilience is mainly about the ability to overcome and recover from adversity. And when I talk about adversity, I'm not talking about necessarily childhood trauma. I'm talking about the everyday ups and downs of life. A parent's divorce, a pet dying, just the everyday things that are adverse events, often happen without our control, and we need to have some sort of power to be able to get over those things, bounce back from those things, recover. And that's really what resilience is all about. It also includes the capacity to navigate the resources that you need to help you to recover. And those resources could be physical, psychological. Those resources could simply be saying, I need help. And being able to do that, I think, is a source of strength in itself. Why is resilience so important? I suppose one of the underlying reasons why I'm quite passionate about talking about resilience is because I was identified as somebody quite early on as being fairly resilient, and I never knew what that meant until recently. For me, it's important because we need to understand what we can do to build resilience in us. And I know that we were all born resilient. There is a natural resilience that we all have. But I'd like to suggest that it's a skill that you can enhance, that you can develop, and you can support other people to become more resilient. It's important because it enhances self-control. It helps with things like problem solving skills. Resilience helps us to self-regulate, to be able to know how far to go in certain situations that might need us to have some sense of control or willpower. It helps us to be realistic. It helps with the development of identity. It even helps with a positive self-worth, self-concept, and self-esteem. So many reasons why we do need to talk about resilience, especially in terms of supporting children within the classroom who may be exhibiting certain types of behaviours due to things that are happening outside of the classroom. And one thing that I remember when I did my PGCE at Greenwich University is that learning is an interesting thing. We learn all the time. We don't just learn in the classroom. But when you've got trauma, stress, other things going on in your mind, psychologically, affecting you physically, it's very, very, very difficult for you to then be focused on learning and all of the things that the classroom expects of you. The learning environment has to have rules. The learning environment has to have a sense of safety so that everybody within that environment can achieve and accomplish something. And if you have trauma, stress, and underlying things going on outside of that classroom environment, there's no doubt that it's going to affect the way in which you learn and your ability to take on new information. But most importantly, it will affect the relationships that you have, and those relationships with your peers, with your teachers, are most definitely going to be affected if you have trauma in the background. I'd like to direct you to my first link. It's a Facebook link, but it is something that you can find on YouTube. And it's an example of the fact that resilience is something that we all have. We worry so much about children and their ability to bounce back. But actually, in that video, you'll see a young man, very young man, who has prosthetic legs. And he's just a young man getting ready for school. And what I love about this video is that he is putting on his prosthetics. He's communicating with his mom, and you can tell from that communication that there's a real good bond, a real attachment that's there. And he's struggling to put on his prosthetic legs, and then halfway through he asks for help, and his mum gives him a little help to finish getting ready for school. But it's just a really good example of the fact that we are all born resilient, and if we can tap into that and have nurturing environments around us, then those environments, those key individuals in our environment, teachers, the community, doctors, other people outside of the family, extended family, can all be a part of that building of resilience in children. One of my favourite quotes is by somebody called Dyer. And in this quote, he says, "With everything that has happened to you, you can either feel sorry for yourself or trust that what has happened is a gift. Everything is either an opportunity to grow or an obstacle to keep you from growing. You get to decide which it is." And that quote has always resonated with me. I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm the authority on looked after children, because I'm not. I'm not an expert in child abuse, and I certainly didn't write the book on local authority care. But I was somebody who was a looked after child. I grew up literally from the age of 6 to the age of 18 when I left local authority care. I grew up within that environment, within the care environment. And I want to talk about that experience a little bit, because I think that that can help people understand the importance of resilience and the importance of relationship building in order for resilience to grow. I used my experience of being a looked after child as a springboard for developing myself, and as a springboard for my own growth and my own well-being. I went into care as a result of my birth mother's physical abuse and psychological abuse. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. And at the time, at the age of 6, of course, I was confused, anxious, scared, and I think overwhelmed by the professionals who were involved in removing me from the family home. It was an interesting experience, and an experience that I would never change because it's made me who I am today. I was removed from the family home via a teacher at school. You guys are in the best position to be able to recognise when a child is on the receiving end of abuse. Safeguarding is one of the issues that I teach and train within schools as part of inset training, and also within other environments. I'm very passionate about safeguarding because of my own experience of abuse. I do see myself as a survivor, and as overwhelming and as painful as my experience was, I honestly believe that it made me who I am today. And the resilience that I had certainly wasn't something that I was able to tap into immediately. When I first went into care, I was observed and spoken to by some people from the NSPCC, the National Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Children, an amazing organisation who was very concerned about extensive physical damage that I had. It was obvious to teachers that something was wrong. I was coming to school in the summer with long sleeve jumpers on. I was very quiet. I didn't interact with other children. But teachers could see from my academic ability that nothing was academically or intellectually wrong. And they alerted the NSPCC, who saw me after school one day. And that was a long time ago. A very weird and strange day where I was removed from school and taken to the local hospital for tests. They were concerned that there were old breakages, bruising that was so extensive that they couldn't just photograph. They wanted to take a closer look. I spent 2 weeks in hospital, and then I was removed to something called an assessment centre, which felt like a prison. It was a Borstal type residential unit, which was there to assess children in order to make a decision as to where they would go afterwards. And as a result of that assessment, I was then put into a large group home. Between 7 and 10 weeks later, I was in that group home, and I spent around a year and a half within that group home waiting for foster carers. I was advertised and put up for fostering. I was sad, I was distressed, and what really kept me going were, well, first of all, I still went to school. The assessment centre had school on the premises, but they felt it was important for me to retain the relationships that I had, the friendships that I had built up at school, even though I wasn't somebody that made friends easily at school. They felt that for consistency's sake, it would be good for me to carry on going to school. And that was one of my saving graces. I think that by them making that decision, it meant that there was some consistency, that leaving the family home and moving to these unknown situations, it just wasn't as painful as it could be because there was an element of consistency in my life. And we know that for children, consistency has to be one of the most important ingredients in a child being able to feel safe and feel secure. So I carried on going to school and carried on kind of learning and developing and growing. and building additional relationships within the care home that I was living, and then in the subsequent foster carers that I lived with. And I'll talk a little bit more about my foster carers and how that went as we move through talking about resilience in more detail. I like to use the analogy of a seesaw in order to really understand the way in which resilience can manifest in anybody's life. And a seesaw is made up of a plank, a metal plank, and a base, a bottom base. And that base at the bottom is actually called a fulcrum. Never knew that till fairly recently. Now that base, in most situations, is pretty central along the seesaw. Now, in the analogy to look at resilience, on that seesaw, you've got everything over the top that we would consider nurture: your environment, your family, your culture, the social networks and social support, everything that is within your upbringing that is not inbuilt, that's not kind of part of your DNA. Every experience that's positive will load the seesaw and push the seesaw into something underneath called positive outcomes. And all of the experiences, all the things within the environment, all the stresses, all the traumatic things that are what we call the negative experiences will push the seesaw into something underneath called negative outcomes. So on this side you've got positive outcomes, and on this side you've got negative outcomes, and the seesaw will swing either way according to the experiences that you have from before birth. There's lots and lots of studies that suggest that what happens in the womb is just as important as what happens after the womb. The next part of that analogy of the seesaw is looking at what's underneath the seesaw. And we've already said that the base of the seesaw has something called a fulcrum. Now that fulcrum and everything at the bottom of the seesaw is what we're going to refer to as nature, the DNA, the genes, the genetic components. And as I've said, there is a genetic component to resilience. Let's say that you are born with your fulcrum slightly misplaced. Your fulcrum is really important because now all of the positive experiences may have a different impact, and your negative experiences that come up may have a different experience. So if you think about that seesaw, if the fulcrum is slightly more to the right, then those negative experiences are going to have more weight. And actually, some of the positive experiences may feel as if they have very little weight. And the best way to describe that, in order to make sense of what I'm saying, is if you think about that individual where they seem to just look on the positive side of life all the time. They seem to have this real energy where they're able to look at the best in every situation. And then the opposite, that person who, when something happens, and it could be something that you would see as being a minor thing, has such a major impact on that individual, and they find it so difficult to kind of pull themselves up out of that. And that could mean depression, that could mean suicidal thoughts, that could mean all sorts of things for that individual, depending on what the stressor and what the traumatic event is. So again, just remember that we've got all of the social and environmental aspects at the top of the seesaw, those experiences that come, good or bad, that send the seesaw in either direction. And then you've got everything at the bottom, nature, that tells us where that fulcrum is placed. And where it's placed is obviously going to impact the gradient of the sway of the seesaw. I think that most adults and most parents and some teachers can sometimes underestimate what children can do, underestimate how resilient children are. We worry about children. We want to protect them from the negatives of life. We want to protect them from the stresses of life. But actually, we need some adversity and some stress in order to grow, mature, develop, and understand how to handle stress. Think about a vaccine. When you go to have a vaccine, you're actually getting immunity which kind of mimics the illness that you're being protected from. It causes the immune system, that vaccine causes the immune system to develop antibodies against the particular condition. But you need to actually be exposed to those antibodies in order for the lymphocytes to remember, so that when in the future your body comes across that negative illness or disease again, its memory will remember it and be able to fight against it. And I look at adversity in the same way. You need some in order to understand how to get over it, how to overcome it. And we learn from adversity. Hopefully we're not one of these people that make the same mistakes over and over and over again. Hopefully what happens when we're in an adverse situation is that we look at it and we say, well, actually, as bad as this is and as awful as I feel, I've learned something here. What have I actually learned? And that's important, because we don't want to be making the same mistake all of the time. So what I'm saying here is that relationships are important. I'm saying that it's important to understand that resilience is something that we're born with, but we can develop and get better at. And one of the things that can help us develop this resilience from birth is this word attachment. We've all heard of Bowlby's theory around attachment. Attachment can be defined as a deep and enduring emotional bond between two people. I believe that attachments can be more than two people, but essentially when Bowlby first did the studies around attachment, he was looking at mothers and children, mothers and their babies. Attachment behaviour in adults towards children is an adult that's able to meet the child's needs appropriately. Attachment theory explains how the parent and child relationship emerges and influences subsequent relationships later on in life. In other words, a very good, healthy attachment can really lay the foundations for good, healthy relationships later on in life. But we also know that attachment is really important for resilience. By having a secure attachment, you feel safe, you feel secure. You're able to explore your environment in a way that makes you learn from that environment, knowing that there is this special person there that's going to shield you from some of the negativities within that environment. And I didn't have that. That's certainly something that I've learned and been able to explore in adulthood. My attachment would be described as insecure. I had a very insecure attachment. And a lot of that stemmed from the fact that not only did I lose a birth mum who was aggressive, abusive, who I was scared of and very fearful of, I then had the experience of living with various foster carers and foster families, and every family broke down. My first foster carers are amazing people who I'm still in contact with now. But at the age of 9.5, they decided that they were going to emigrate to the Caribbean. And my social worker gave me the option of staying with them and going to the Caribbean, or leaving them and going back into residential care to look for a new family. It was a difficult decision, but I decided that I wanted to stay. And of course, that was because I felt that bond with my mum, as insecure as it was, I still loved her and I still wanted her to be the mum that she never was. And I had it in my head that at some stage I would leave local authority care and go back to the loving arms of my mum. I had that hope and had that self-belief, and it kind of kept me going during my years of being a looked after child. So attachment is important for safety, it's important for security, it's important for resilience, but it's also important for regulation, to help you regulate your feelings, your emotions. As a child, it's very difficult to regulate emotions, and we depend on the adults around us to do that. As an adult, there is hope, isn't there, that as an adult we know where to draw the line and we know how far to go. And even when we are suffering from sadness, stress, when we're feeling down, there has to be a point where we kind of say, right, come on now, I'm going to pick myself back up. And all of the attachments that you had as a child growing up during your formative years is what's kept that kind of element of being able to regulate and have that strength behind you as an adult. I've looked at trauma as part of my work as a motivational speaker, and trauma can be described as sort of events that cause distress. Trauma can be one single event, one situation of abuse, one bereavement, any situation that causes long-term emotional distress. But when as a child you've got a series of traumas on top of each other that can impact physically, emotionally, spiritually, and cause lots of exhibiting behaviours, and some of the behaviours that I'm sure some of you may see in the children within your schools. Loss in all its capacities, the death of a loved one, through suicide, the loss of a parent going to prison, a parent that's unavailable due to drug and alcohol use, drug and alcohol dependency, substance misuse, a parent who has a mental health condition, who may or may not be taking their medication in order to regulate and keep that mental health condition under some element of control. a parent who just doesn't know how to be a parent, for whatever reason, is abusive in a variety of ways. All of these things can cause pain. All of these things can cause distress and significant damage and trauma. In 2016 to 2017, a few years ago now, there were approximately 96,000 looked after children within the UK. 96,000 children who, for the most part, were victims of either abuse, neglect, or a combination of abuse and neglect. In the last 5 years, the population of looked after children in the UK has increased by around 5 to 6%, according to the NSPCC. This trend isn't the same throughout the whole of the UK and throughout the whole of the 4 counties. Throughout the whole of the 4 nations. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, the numbers are slightly lower. However, you've got more extended family and more family placements. So in places like Ireland, you've got more family members becoming foster carers and looking after children within the family environment. Trauma responses are different for different people, and I know for me, my trauma response was very much guarded. The inability to form bonds, the inability to trust people, not feeling confident in myself, low self-esteem. And it took one teacher, my science teacher in secondary school, who saw something in me that perhaps others didn't see. She was kind of my guiding light. She was the one that said, there's more to you than this. And you can achieve anything if you put your mind to it. And I thank God for that teacher, because without one strong, positive role model, attachment, secure, positive person in my life, I really don't know where I would be right now. You'll see different traumatic